Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for July 2014. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. During this program, we're going to examine why the U.S. Army officer was so important to the war effort for the United States. One of the new sections we're debuting this month is called What Happened 100 Years Ago. This is to inform the listener of what went on 100 years ago during the First World War. During July of 1914, it was called the July Crisis. The assassination a month earlier of Archduke Franz Ferdinand led to a month of diplomatic maneuvering between Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Great Britain. It was called the July Crisis. Believing correctly that the Serbian officials, especially officers of the Black Hand, were involved in the plot to murder Archduke Franz Ferdinand and wanting to finally end Serbia's interference in Bosnia, Austria-Hungary delivered to Serbia the July Ultimatum, a series of 10 demands that were intentionally made unacceptable to provoke a war with Serbia. When Serbia agreed to only 8 of the demands, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th. The Russian Empire, unwilling to allow Austria-Hungary to eliminate its influence in the Balkans and support of its longtime friend Serbia, ordered a partial mobilization one day later on July 29th. Germany mobilized on July 30th, and Russia responded by declaring a full mobilization that same day. Germany imposed an ultimatum on Russia through its ambassador in Berlin to demobilize within 12 hours or face war. Russia responded by offering to negotiate the terms of a demobilization. However, Germany refused to negotiate, declaring war against Russia on August 1, 1914. Now, a WW1 Centennial National Update. The WW1 Centennial Commission is gathering steam. The Commission held on June 10th a reception in Washington, D.C. for members of Congress and embassy officials from countries participating in the Centennial. On June 14th, the Commission sponsored a trade fair in Washington, D.C., giving participating groups the opportunity to advertise their Centennial plans and programs. After war was declared in August of 1914 in Europe, preparedness for war came to the forefront in America. The United States, with its tremendous resources and its potential strength, could and would, if needs be, cast a great and perhaps deciding weight in the European war. An unlimited supply of manpower could be drawn upon, but who was going to train them? There were regular Army officers, but not enough to train the millions of men that would be in the United States Army. One way to become a U.S. Army officer was to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, but this usually took 3 to 4 years to become an officer. Although West Pointers were thoroughly trained as soldiers, this was not a practical solution for the U.S. Army, which needed to expand from a few 100,000 to over 1 million men in a very short amount of time. Another way to become an officer was through the Reserve Officer Training Corps. The concept of ROTC in the United States began with the Morrill Act of 1862, which established land-grant colleges. Part of the federal government's requirement for these schools was that they include military tactics as part of their curriculum, forming what became known as ROTC. It wasn't until 1916, with the National Defense Act, that the ROTC became a viable way to supply the U.S. Army with officers. The third way to become an officer was through the Plattsburgh camps. The camps were set up and funded by Preparedness Movement, a group of influential pro-Allied Americans. They recognized that the standing army of the U.S. was far too small to affect the war in Europe, and would have to expand immensely if the U.S. went to war. The movement established the camps to train additional potential Army officers during the summers of 1915 and 16. The largest and best known was near Plattsburgh, New York. 40,000 men, all college graduates, attended the Plattsburgh camp and other sites. They became physically fit, learned to march and shoot, and ultimately provide the cadre for wartime officer corps. Enlistees were required to pay their own expenses. Suggestions by labor unions that talented working class youths be invited to Plattsburgh were ignored. These camps were formalized under the Military Training Camp Association in 1917. One of the differences between the officers and enlisted men were that officers had to purchase their own equipment and uniforms, while enlisted soldiers were issued theirs from the government. Before the war, officer equipment and uniforms was a niche business, but once war was declared, providing officers with equipment became big business. We're going to examine some of the catalogs and advertisements that officers could look at to purchase their equipment. Because the business of supplying officers with uniforms and equipment expanded greatly in such a short amount of time, a lot of tailors and other people who made equipment weren't exactly sure what the U.S. standards were for officers. Some of the officers' uniforms varied greatly from the others, and also their equipment. Some were patterned on the English uniform, some were patterned on the French, and some, if they could get them, were American style and pattern uniform. It took until the fall of 1917 before U.S. Army officers started wearing a standard pattern uniform, but there were still variations in color and material. Behind the lines and also in the United States, officers could afford to look sharp in their tailor-made uniforms, but on the front lines and in the trenches, officers found it much easier to blend in with their men, usually wearing enlisted men's uniform. And the reason for this was that if they stood out, they were usually picked off by enemy snipers. During the First World War, the separation between officers and enlisted men was far greater than it is now. Officers were considered gentlemen and therefore needed to act accordingly. Being a gentleman provided the officers with a lot of privileges, but it also entailed a lot of responsibilities, and if they failed this, they could embarrass their family and themselves. A junior officer in the U.S. Army was responsible to lead his men in combat, train them for combat, and also he was responsible for their health and well-being, which meant doing a lot of paperwork. Not since the Civil War has the U.S. Army grown so large so quickly. During the Civil War, officers were chosen usually by state governors. During the First World War, because this was a national effort and national draft, officers were chosen nationally on a set criteria and also trained on a national basis.
Bumping with those hand grenades and machine guns, the holy spade. Alert, gas, put on your mask, adjust it correctly and hurry up fast. Drop, there's a rocket for the hot barrage. Down, hug the ground, close your hand, don't stand. Creep and crawl, follow me, that's all. Now, boys, go do it! Hey! Get somebody, boys, get 'em, stick 'em with the bayonet, ram it on. What do you hear? Nothing here, don't fear, all clear. That's the life of a stroll when you take a patrol. Out in no man's land, ain't it grand? Out in no